Again, my name is DJ Vlamming. I am president and co-owner of the Arizona office for Association Reserves. I have, let's see this, there we go. I've been with Association Reserves since 1996. Just celebrated my 28th anniversary, and I've been working with Arizona clients since 1997. And my office is responsible for the entire state of Arizona as well as clients in Mexico. And this evening, we're going to talk about some reserve study basics to help give you a better understanding of the concepts and terminology in the reserve studies. But to get really basic, what is a reserve study? A reserve study is a planning document and a budgeting model. Its purpose is to help associations prepare for significant, irregular expenses over time while minimizing or eliminating surprises and special assessments. Having a reserve study is important because asset deterioration and the expenses that come from that deterioration are inevitable. The only question is, how prepared will you be? A reserve study helps you avoid being surprised by an expense that was gradually approaching over the last 10 or 20 years. We have a lot of communities with nice clubhouses and buildings, and we don't want them to get run down and look like this old barn at some point. And it takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of planning to keep them maintained and looking nice. And let's talk about some other reasons that encourage regular reserve planning. Governing documents. They typically empower and require the board to collect funds that will adequately provide for major common area expenses. Generally accepted accounting principles, which are often referred to as GAAP, and these are standard accounting practices across all 50 states. They call for associations to annually balance the physical deterioration of the common areas with a sufficient amount of cash to ensure the association is on track to replace its assets. That's basically a reserve study. State laws. And working with clients across the country, we have like 11 or 12 offices total across the country. We found there's around 30 states now that have laws requiring some level or frequency of reserve studies. Now, I'd normally ask, does anybody know if Arizona is one of those states, and do we have a law requiring reserve studies? Since everyone's muted, I'll answer for you. No, Arizona does not have a law requiring reserve studies. Does that mean you don't need one? Now, I have two answers to that. First, check your governing documents because a lot of times they are going to require it. Second, the board has a fiduciary duty to the membership. If the association does not have a current reserve study to help them plan for large, significant expenses, I would argue that the board is not upholding its duty. In that respect, a reserve study should still be considered a requirement even though the state doesn't mandate it. Then finally, there's the fundamental, practical need for information. Boards and management need a periodic status update on the association's major upcoming expenses and its ability to pay for them. While a reserve study may sometimes appear overwhelming, they can be anywhere from 10 to well over 100 pages if you've looked at one. All that data and information really boils down to just three key results. A list of what you're reserving for is the component list. Now, this is the foundation of your reserve study. A measurement of reserve fund's strength is what we call percent funded. And then a plan to prepare for the expenses on that component list is your funding plan. So those first two results establish where you are now, like a current status. And the third is a recommendation of where to go from here. So when reviewing your reserve study, you want to make sure you can identify those three key results. And we're going to review those results as well by first looking at the component list. As I mentioned, it forms the foundation of your reserve study. All the other results are based on the component list, so it's important that it be current and credible. Your reserve fund is not a catch-all for any expense, and your reserve study is not going to account for every potential expense the association may face. So how do we know what should be included on the component list? Reserve Study Standards outlines this three-part test to help determine what items are appropriate for reserve funding. So first one, the association has the obligation to maintain or replace an existing item. This means reserve funding is limited to existing assets only. Reserves should not be used or spent on new additions, which are considered a capital improvement to the community. Second, the need and schedule for the project can be reasonably anticipated. This means it's predictable. Predictability is very important for reserve funding because we need to be able to reasonably estimate when a project will be scheduled. Expenses or projects deemed unpredictable are typically not included in the reserve study. Finally, total cost for the project is material to the association and can be reasonably estimated. This means the cost of the project is significant and not something you can easily pay for out of the operating budget. Now, the cost must also be something that we can estimate or is provided by a knowledgeable third party. So this test narrows down reserve projects or components to those that are reasonably predictable and of a significant expense to the association. Now, the items funded in the reserve study are going to vary depending on the type of community we're working with and its common area responsibilities. But here are some examples of typical items you'll find in a reserve study. We see a lot of asphalt, whether it's private streets or parking lots. You have pool areas and related items such as the decks, fences, furniture, and equipment. You have playground equipment and other recreational amenities like tennis courts, basketball courts, painting for your perimeter theme walls, fences, and common buildings, and then roofing on common buildings. And as I mentioned, reserves are not going to account for every potential expense an association may face. So what items are typically not included? Well, the main thing are items that are unpredictable. I kind of, you know, emphasized that a couple slides ago. That means they have an unknown useful life, the unpredictable remaining life, maybe an unknown scope of work and cost. Now, common items that fall under this category or this issue are electrical wiring and plumbing also means irrigation. These items are underground, they're in the walls, they're generally not accessible to inspect, evaluate, and quantify. They're outside the scope of a reserve study. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be included. For example, if your landscaper comes to you and says, we're having a lot more problems with your irrigation system. I think you should plan a major renovation for $100,000 in the next 3 to 5 years. We can plug that into the study and schedule it for you, but we can't give you those budget parameters. Okay, also, items that have extended or indefinite life expectancies are not going to be included in the reserve study. A good example of that would be buildings. We're not going to budget to demo and rebuild a clubhouse or townhomes or any common buildings. Now, we are budgeting for parts of the buildings like the roofing, maybe doors and windows, depending on what kind of building it is, and other aspects of the building. Annual expenses are more appropriately included in the operating budget, regardless of how much they cost. If it's happening every year, it's really more of an operating expense. And finally, small, insignificant expenses are inappropriate to be funding through reserves. Now, we compiled the component list using that three-part test as part of our site inspection work. This is also known as the physical analysis portion of the reserve study. During this process, we look over the community to identify those items that are going to be included in the reserve study, and we attempt to evaluate their condition based on visual observation. Now, let's look at some red flag examples of what we see during site inspections. Now, I know it doesn't rain that much in Arizona, but a plastic tarp is not the proper way to keep your roof watertight. Is this roof going to positively or negatively impact curb appeal and property values? I would argue negatively. This is an example of unsightly stucco siding. The stucco needs to be painted to maintain the appearance, but painting also helps prevent water intrusion. Have you ever heard that asphalt never needs to be repaved or replaced? I periodically get challenged by board members saying that, the city never repaves their streets, so why should they budget for it? I'm not sure where they're driving, but I'm constantly running into city streets being repaved. Um, but this picture here is a good example of failed asphalt that needs repaving. Now, sometimes we find communities where current members are no longer interested in playing tennis, so they stop maintaining the court. Now, if I were interested in purchasing a home in this community, and saw this tennis court while driving around, I would have to seriously reconsider buying that community. This is a red flag that says either they don't have enough money to maintain the tennis court or they have poor maintenance standards. This is still a common area amenity that either needs to be maintained or just remove it. The final product of the physical analysis is the component list. Here is a sample list where each item that's funded in the reserve study is identified with a scheduled useful life, remaining life, and current cost. Now, once this information is compiled, we can then move into the financial analysis portion of the reserve study. And that takes us to our second key reserve study result, which is a measurement of reserve fund strength. Let's take a look at how to do that. Now, fortunately, this is a pretty simple concept. Now, I'm illustrating with an example of a $10,000 expense that occurs every 10 years. I've eliminated the effects of inflation to keep the illustration simple. The question is, how much should the association have in the bank to prepare for this recurring expense? Now, this is a trick question, and I know you can't answer it, so I'll tell you the answer is, it depends. Real complicated, right? It depends which year you are in. In the years approaching the expense, the reserve fund should be growing closer to that estimated cost. When after the project is completed, you start the cycle of saving all over again. So it's simply a matter of having an amount of funds on hand equivalent to the component's deterioration. So if our component is half used up, you should have half of its replacement cost on hand. In this example, half of the life being used up means the component's 5 years old, and we should have saved $5,000 by now. Now, if we did have that $5,000, we're on track to replace that asset in 10 years. If we didn't have 5,000 yet, if we had less, that means we need to alter our savings plan to accumulate more than $5,000 over the next 5 years. So this concept is called the fully funded balance. The fully funded balance is a benchmark balance of how much the association should have in its reserve fund at a point in time. It's defined as the fractional age of a component multiplied by its current cost. Now, this same formula is applied to the entire component list to come up with a fully funded balance total for the association. Now, the fully funded balance is calculated and reported annually, typically for the start of each fiscal year. Now, here you can see the fully funded balance calculation for this set of reserve components. Now, remember, this represents the deterioration or the accumulating reserve needs of the association at a point in time. It does not reflect the total replacement value of the reserve components. So you can see there's different components here with varying lifespans, remaining lifespans, and costs. But all this data boils down to estimating the association should have about $154,000 in its reserve fund. Now, once we have this figure, we can calculate reserve fund strength. Percent funded is our reserve fund strength indicator. It measures how well reserve funds match the association's needs. The percent funded calculation is very simple. It's just the ratio of the actual reserve cash, or in our case, we're usually projecting forward, so the projected reserve balance to that benchmark fully funded balance. And we've divided percent funded as a measure of reserve fund strength into 3 ranges. 0 to 30% funded is the weak range. 70% funded and above is considered the strong range. And that middle area between 30 and 70% funded is the fair range. Now, percent funded can be thought of as similar to a credit score since it measures risk. It provides a quick evaluation of an association's financial health. Now, if you have a basic understanding of these percent funded ranges, you can pick up any reserve study, look at percent funded, and generally know if the association is financially strong, fair, or weak. Here's where you can see why we have those percent funded ranges. This graph illustrates the relationship between percent funded and special assessment risk. As you notice that as percent funded goes down, special assessment risk goes up, and quite a bit. In that 0 to 30% weak range, special assessment risk averages 37%. That means anytime an association is in this range, they have a better than 1 in 3 chance of needing a special assessment that year due to the lack of reserve funding. At the other end of the spectrum, you can see that special assessments are rare among associations with strong reserves at 70% funded and above. Now, if you're wondering how associations compare, this national profile percent funded ratings compiled from about 25,000 reserve studies. You can see that most associations fall in that middle fair range, but there are plenty of others both in the red weak range and in the green strong range. It's a mistake to think that all associations are poorly funded and that no association could ever afford to be well funded. The entire spectrum exists. So, what are some consequences of a weak reserve fund? Well, primarily we think of special assessments. That's the trigger we're always pushing. Now, special assessments should be avoided. They're inherently unfair to a very select group of homeowners. Another consequence is deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance means owners are putting up with, cracked pavement, maybe leaking roofs, peeling paint. And at its worst, deferred maintenance can lead to a serious decline in property values. So let's look at some examples of deferred maintenance. Well, that looks tempting. Is this a jacuzzi or a mud bath at a day spa? Now, this would be a major red flag if you were walking the community and considering purchasing a home here. These are nice looking secure lounges. The worn and torn slings are going to result in somebody getting hurt. Now, this association should be concerned about potential liability. And right now, with the way insurance rates are, you got to be concerned about how any kind of a lawsuit would affect their insurance going forward. Why do we need to maintain balcony decks? Now, this was originally put in the presentation as kind of a funny picture. However, there have been multiple balcony collapses and failures across the country, where a lot of people have been severely injured and even died. At this point, or a couple years ago now, California created legislation requiring balcony inspections by certified engineers every 9 years. This is now a reserve study component in our California offices because the timing is predictable and the cost is significant. It's a lot of money to have an engineer go and inspect a bunch of balconies. So, although Arizona does not have a law requiring balcony inspections, I would encourage you, if you have balconies, I would encourage you to get them inspected, especially common decks and elevated walkways that the association would be responsible to maintain, just to make sure they're secure. We want to make sure the residents are safe and we don't have any of our people, getting hurt. Okay, the third reserve study result is the funding plan. So we're going to spend a few minutes reviewing this. Reserve study standards require every reserve funding plan to be based on four principles. First, the funding plan needs to provide sufficient cash to complete reserve projects on time. The funding plan should have a stable contribution rate. Now, this is desirable because it prevents the irregular reserve expenses from disrupting the budget. The funding plan should be evenly distributed across the ownership base, meaning it's fair to both current and future owners. And finally, the funding plan should be fiscally safe and responsible. While the principles for all funding plans are the same, the objectives can vary. Let's review reserve funding objectives. So how strong do you want your reserve fund to be? And how tolerant is your association of special assessment risk? Reserve study standards defines three funding objectives. There's full funding, threshold funding, and baseline funding. Full funding is the conservative objective to achieve 100% funded where special assessments are rare. This is considered a low risk objective. Baseline funding is the opposite extreme, which means it has the goal to just barely keep your reserves cash positive through the years. This is considered a high risk objective. Now, threshold funding is a strategic choice of a particular percent funded target somewhere between the full funding and baseline funding objectives. So the risk is more moderate, but that also is going to depend on the objective you choose. So when we're creating funding plans, we're always looking at the percent funding graph, and that ties into cash flow. But this is what a full funding profile looks like on a percent funding graph. In this example, the association is starting at about 55% funded, but it has the goal to reach and remain at that 100% funded level. Note how the association is never in that weak, high risk range when following this funding plan. Now, the criticism of this plan is that it's too aggressive and expensive. But as someone that creates these plans, I want to point out that it takes around 20 years to actually achieve the objective. That's not too aggressive. I don't have a short-term time frame in mind to get an association from 55% to 100% funded. I want to create a nice long-term uptrend that eventually achieves that objective at some point in the 30 years we're illustrating. Now, is it expensive? Yes, but it's also expensive to maintain your properties and your assets. So that doesn't change. Um, so again, it's expensive and it takes planning, and we want to make sure that there's a good amount of money set aside to accomplish that. Now here's the same association, but we've slightly reduced the reserve transfer rate to illustrate pursuing a baseline funding objective. A baseline funding plan is still supposed to provide enough reserves to complete reserve projects on time. So don't make the mistake in thinking reserve transfers can be significantly reduced by pursuing this objective. Now, although it's designed to never go below zero, notice there's 9 years where the association is in that 0 to 30% weak range. If you remember from the discussion on percent funded, associations in this range have a 1 in 3 chance of needing a special assessment that year due to lack of sufficient reserve funds. So while we're designing this to never go below zero, the likelihood is this association will probably have about 3 special assessments scattered through those years. So what's the cost difference between the full and baseline funding objectives? Does full funding require 2 or 3 times the transfer rate of a baseline plan? No, it doesn't actually. We have found, on average, that reserve transfers for a full funding objective are about 10 to 15% more than transfers required for a baseline funding objective. The problem is, many associations are not even contributing enough to achieve a baseline objective. One of the biggest misconceptions about reserve funding is that people believe transfers are saving for the future and only benefit future owners. That's just incorrect. Reserve transfers offset asset deterioration that's occurring now while the current owners are using and enjoying the assets. If current owners pay their fair share of asset deterioration on an ongoing basis, the future takes care of itself. Reserve transfers and reserve funding are not charity for some future group of owners. And it's unfair for any group of owners to bear the burden of decades of deterioration. Okay, we're getting close to wrapping this up. I've got a couple of frequently asked questions to run through. So first, we're often asked, what kinds of reserve studies are there? Well, there's 3 main types. What we call a level 1 is a full reserve study. This means it's a first-time reserve study. The component list is being developed from scratch. So this is the most time-consuming and most comprehensive option. The good thing is if you have a good reserve study in place with good quantity detail and other information, you'll need this option once. And then from there, we update it. So the next option is what we call a level 2, also known as an update with site visit reserve study. Now this study involves a new site inspection to reevaluate the component list from a previous reserve study. Um, we also obtain information from the board and management in terms of what projects have been completed since the last reserve study. We get updated financials to make sure we have the most current data in that respect. So the recommendation is to conduct the level 2 update with site visit every 3 years. Then finally, there's the level 3 update no site visit, which we also refer to as an NSV. And this study involves updating the component list from the most recent reserve study based solely on the information that the client provides. So again, we get the list of reserve projects that have been completed, we get updated financials, but as the name suggests, there is no site inspection involved. So in that respect, the level 3 or the no site visit update is the least comprehensive and the least expensive option. Now, how often should you update the reserve study? The American Institute of Certified Public Accountants and generally accepted accounting principles recommend reviewing and or updating your reserve study annually. Now, since there is no law in Arizona requiring reserve studies, this doesn't mean you have to update the study annually. But management and the board should be reviewing the most recently completed reserve study every year as part of the budget planning process for the next year. So if you have a reserve study from last year or the year before, as you're going into your budget season here, you should be looking at it to see what are the changes in the funding plan. If you look at the cash flow detail, the funding plan is changing every year because we're factoring in inflation. We have different cash flow methodologies going on. So if you're still budgeting the same amount as recommended 2 or 3 years ago, you're already behind. So make sure you're looking at the financial aspects and planning to adjust the funding transfers. Also, it's important to look at the scheduled projects. If you're talking big projects like roofs or paint or asphalt, then that means the board needs to be more proactive in starting to get some inspection work done, get some bids, and maybe fine tune that timing. Now, update timing for the reserve study may also be dictated by CC&Rs or governing documents and state laws. There are some states like California and Washington that do have laws requiring annual reserve study updates and disclosures. Now, CC&Rs will often require an update at least every 5 years. But honestly, that's just too infrequent. Too much information is lost. There's too much turnover. It's not good practice. So CAI's best practices and industry recommendation recommend updating the reserve study with a diligent site inspection at least every 3 years with consideration for that no site visit update during the in-between years. Okay, getting close to the end here and just going to plug a couple things. So, my business partner and a couple of industry professionals created this podcast called HOA Insights, and it's really geared toward board members. So that's why I wanted to share it with you. If you go to hoainsights.org, they have a list of all their, I don't know what you call it, the playlist. Um, but again, it's geared toward board members and talking about board issues and what you go through as volunteers and trying to run your association. So if anybody's interested, I encourage you to take a listen. And finally, if you're interested in learning more about reserve studies, I want to refer you to our website, reservestudy.com. We have a lot of frequently asked questions. We have articles. We regularly host a lot of webinars as well. And there's recordings of past webinars on the website that you can watch at your leisure. Some of them are co-hosted with other industry professionals, and they get into more detail and in depth than what I talked about tonight. So, um, anytime you want to check it out and watch something, it's free to go take a look. Also, anybody interested in proposals, I guess it's more for management, you can request proposals through our website 24/7.